The world's largest fan-voted award show, the American Music Awards, airs Memorial Day on KHOU 11. When asked what decade brought us the best in music, many say the 60s. It was the advent of rock and roll and a counterculture movement that was about more than just the music. Of course, the 70s brought us disco and dance. Hey, I loved it. But for others, the answer to my question is the decade of the 80s. Rap was taking off. Technology to play music on the go improved with better cassettes in cars and this thing called a Sony Walkman. Also a game changer, a network called MTV introduced new songs as mini movies. Artists became global phenomenons and household names. The songs covered a range of emotions and experiences: love, death, money, and lots of living. And there were enough songs as well as enough hits about babies to outnumber the baby boomers buying up the music.
Tell me, baby.
And while there are plenty of sugar-sweet songs the whole family could enjoy, there was also more than a little controversy. The Parents Music Resource Center criticized you all for being too racy. You actually testified in front of Congress.
Myself, Frank Zappa, John Denver went and testified to stand up for our First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, artistic expression. And they said, oh, this is a violent song. But it's not a violent song. It's just rebellious. Fight the power. We got to fight the power that beat.
All this milestone music defined the decade, which must have made our next guest's job seem nearly impossible. He's the author of 501 Essential Albums of the 80s, the music fan's definitive guide. Music journalist Gary Graff is here to share how he made his list and which artist got 86. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. I have a feeling with the way music goes, we'll see you again and again and again. All right. Just a little bit about your background for people who don't know. You lived the last 40 years in Detroit, which we know is the home of Motown Studios, home to several key artists, Aretha Franklin, Bob Seger, Eminem. You, as a kid, loved music over cartoons.
Pretty much. I was fortunate enough. I had a brother who was 11 and a half years older than I was and a hippie. So, while all the other kids, maybe Scooby-Doo, the theme from Scooby-Doo was their favorite song. Mine was Steppenwolf, Born to be Wild.
Yeah.
And I was hearing the Beatles and all that great Motown music, the Rolling Stones, you name it, in real time. And even if I wasn't completely aware of what I was hearing, it was making the impact that led to what I've been doing for the last 45 plus years.
Yeah, okay, 7 years old, Born to be Wild. Were your parents concerned?
Probably. We didn't talk about it much, but.
All right. You wrote great music bios, the one from Neil Young, Bob Seger, Bruce Springsteen, Alice at 75. And the great thing about your books is even if you had no interest or didn't even know who those artists were, you write such great stories. And it's fascinating to follow how they got into the industry and where they are today.
Thank you for that. That's what we try to do.
All right, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. We had you on about that one. It was interesting because I was like, you left out so-and-so and so-and-so. You're like, wait a minute. That person was really more popular in the 80s. I'm like, oh, you're right. Sometimes those decades kind of bleed over. But that's what led you to do 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s.
Yeah, we really see this as a series, and hopefully we'll continue to do and go back for the 70s and 60s. But the 80s were very important. Whenever you say 80s to somebody, they get a smile on their face.
Yeah.
Whether they wore spandex or used hairspray or what everybody had an experience in the 80s, even somebody who wasn't born in the 80s. That's a decade that's somehow been passed along to them culturally, not just musically, but music was so intertwined with the culture then. So they've seen The Breakfast Club or 16 Candles or Pretty in Pink. These are all cultural touchstones
Yeah.
that have had a life beyond the 80s that
And it was made so much more accessible. Today we have, of course, the internet and social media, but it was made so much more accessible with that thing I mentioned earlier, the Sony Walkman and then MTV.
everything about it. We had portable music, the Sony, the Walkman, then the boombox, came along. You could have your music with you 24/7 as part of everything you did, including, as you note, MTV coming on TV. And then we got CDs, which made us buy all the music we already owned again. But what was key, I'll tell you, what was key about the CDs was it did bring the parental generation back into music because it was new technology. It was the sound and everything was so great that everyone wanted one for their home.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, especially, there were a limited number of CDs you could get. So somebody who was maybe out of the active music consuming age had to buy a Duran Duran CD because there wasn't much else.
Yeah, yeah.
And suddenly became fans of this music.
And you just played it over and over again. All right, when it comes to MTV, some of the staples, of course, one was AC/DC.
An early staple because a lot of them were AC/DC, Duran Duran, the British acts, because they were making videos all along, whereas in America it was a new thing.
Yeah.
To make a music video.
Michael Jackson. I remember we had planned our whole evening around MTV's unveiling of Michael Jackson and Thriller, and a telemarketer called me. That poor telemarketer, because I was like, "Are you nuts? Do you know what's about to come on? You stop calling people right now." But of course, Michael Jackson. That was amazing as well. And then Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA. I actually took a trip to Ireland, and we walked into a bar, and they stopped and they stared at us, and all of a sudden they said, "Hit it!" And they started playing "Born in the USA." We are born in the USA. But just the reach that it had was not only across the country, but around the world.
Absolutely. It introduced, here in America especially, it introduced us to the whole, if you want to just call it new wave. It introduced us to that whole segment of music. It was basically anybody who had a video in those early days was getting played and suddenly became very popular because they were on TV.
Yeah, Madonna, Prince, 1999, Bon Jovi, Journey. All right, and then there was the hip hop genre, which, as we know, rap kind of got more defined in the 90s, but is kind of part of that genre. But Sugar Hill Gang, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious, Run DMC, LL Cool J, the Ghetto Boys from Houston, that also became more mainstream when we saw it.
Sure. I mean, you had record companies signed it. They took what was essentially street art and they saw a market for it. Sugar Hill Records, like you mentioned, and then the major labels came in, Def Jam, that came out of New York University, and there was they felt like there was a market for it. Then you had Blondie help to popularize it as well, and it became intertwined with popular music, rap music or rock music at the time. And then because of MTV, all of this was piled into one place. So it was one of the few times in our history, our cultural history, everybody or a great many people were fans of music, not just rock music, not rap, R&B, and soul, but music, because you were having experiences that involved every style and every genre of music.
Yeah, my favorite at the time was R&B. Teddy Pendergrass, loved TKO. Luther Vandross, Never Too Much, Stop to Love. Whitney Houston, of course. I remember I was working in the radio station. I was a DJ at the time, and this record set showed up, and they said next year is going to be Whitney's year. We're like, who's Whitney? And then they asked us to please go listen to her in San Marcos. She was like playing in a barn. Mm-hmm. And then a year later, we're like, that's that girl, that's that woman. And of course, as we know, she became super big. Had hits in the 90s as well, where I think we saw the real Whitney voice, but in the beginning, Greatest Love of All, How Will I Know, Didn't We Almost Have It All, Al Green, Soul Survivor, and then Tina Turner redid one of Al Green's songs, Let's Stay Together.
Yeah, you had you were able to make anything happen in music in the 80s. It seemed like you could bring artists back from the abyss and have comebacks. You could break new artists. You could break entirely new genres of music, or at least what had been underground.
Yeah, and to your
genres of
point, Tina
music.
Turner was somebody that we knew, I think, back in the '60s, and then all she kept coming
Yeah.
back, and she keeps, just kept coming back, and then same with Aretha Franklin. She was like, "Look, make me relevant," and then she was, "Freeway of Love," "I Knew You Were Waiting," with George Michael, "Who's Zooming Who," and then as you mentioned, and then it made way for new artists, Bobby Brown.
Yeah, and the whole New Jack Swing, Guy and New Edition, and which begat the new wave of boy bands with New Kids on the Block. There was such a huge audience now for music, different from the '70s, certainly different from the '60s, and there was so much money being made within the industry that things were being thrown against the wall, and largely they were sticking.
Yeah.
You really were. And when you think about in the '80s, if you had a number one album, it probably sold 500,000, 700,000, 800,000, even 1 million copies in a week.
Wow.
You
and
you
you're
really
right, that variety, because I remember radio stations constantly going, okay, are we adult contemporary? Are we pop? Are we, what do we, they are constantly questioning what, genre they're going to go under. But then we went into glam rock with Twisted Sister, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, heavy metal, Iron Maiden, Quiet Riot, Metallica, and then pop, NXS, George Michael, as I mentioned earlier, U2, Debbie Gibson, New Kids on the Block, Paula Abdul, Straight Up, the whole bit. And then, of course, there was country, which was the '80s country on the cusp of what country is today. Because right around the '90s, country kind of took a swing, and it was like, is it country or is it pop or what is it? So it kind of widened their appeal.
You had the class of '89, which was Garth Brooks and Clint Black and Alan Jackson and Travis Tritt. And these were guys who were raised on country, but also on rock and roll.
Yeah.
And they were creating a different kind of country sound. And also in Nashville, you had studio engineers and producers also raised on rock and roll, and they were bringing that sonic touch to country music.
Yeah.
And it was a very different sounding country music, but guess what? Everybody liked it.
Yeah,
Or a
well,
whole
and
lot of people liked it.
Yeah, and then the artist that made a lot of people like it was kind of country, but kind of blues and kind of jazz, Stevie Ray Vaughan as well. Okay, the other thing was, I always remember from the '80s, as I mentioned, working at K98 Radio in Austin, music that funded a cause. And I remember I was working late one night, and there was a knock on the door, and I answered it. Why was I answering a door at midnight at the radio station? I don't know, but I did. A man handed me a box, and he said, "Embargoed till 2025 tomorrow morning." I was like, what does embargoed mean? I brought it in, I opened it up, and I played it, and it was "We Are the World." So we had so many songs during the '80s that funded causes like that. This is considered the ultimate super musical group of all time. I don't know if we could ever get them all together like that again, but every voice, or not every voice, but a ton of the voices that were hot of the '80s were in that room.
That was a big night. What was the documentary Music's Greatest Night? Although I'll tell you, I favor "Do They Know It's Christmas?"
Yeah.
Band-Aid, which was the one that started it all, and there was something just a little more homespun about that to me. It's also a much better song.
Yeah.
Than We Are the World was.
I don't know. We might
yeah.
have a throwdown
I'm
right
sorry,
here.
no,
Okay.
we'll have to.
Look, there comes a time when we heed a certain call. No, I don't know. We're going to fight about that one, Gary. But there's another one.
I won't sing to you, but I will still hold "Do They Know It's Christmas" up as the better tune.
All right. There was another one. That's What Friends Are For, because as we know, in the '80s, HIV/AIDS was a critical thing in health that we needed to address.
There were, and I keep going back to this idea, you could do anything with music in the '80s, or the '80s was the first decade where it felt like you could do anything.
Yeah.
And things would work because we were so attuned to music. It had become so a part of our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. And artists were using it to do good things. With Farm Aid, I remember it wasn't necessarily a song, but the fact that artists had come together, and we had missed a press conference where Willie Nelson was talking about why he was doing Farm Aid, and they asked me to go out and get a soundbite from the PR person. And I thought to myself in my young days, where I thought, why can't you do what you want to do? I thought, I'm just going to call Willie Nelson and I'm going to go interview him. And I called him and he answered the phone. He's like, "Hello?"
There you go.
And he goes, "Well, you can come on out to the house. house if you want to. So I drove out, that threw dripping springs and a whole bit. He showed me around his house, showed me his recording studio, and I did the interview. But again, how music was connected, because they had such great power, connecting to great causes as well. Okay, and then there's that whole area of movie soundtracks. Kenny Loggins was known as the kind of king of the soundtracks, but you had Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, The Breakfast Club, Top Gun, Dirty Dancing, all of those.
Just a refinement in the industry in the 70s. Of course, we'd had Saturday Night Fever, we'd had Grease, and there'd been hit movie soundtracks before in the 50s and the 60s, but this was the jukebox soundtrack, where, you know, a collection of songs that served the movie, but weren't necessarily thematically unified, other than the fact they were in the same movie. The Big Chill soundtrack really started all that, and look what it did in boosting Motown in the early part of the 80s. And then you had, you know, Flashdance and Xanadu and Fame, and, you know, Purple Rain, people forget, was a soundtrack album.
Yeah.
By Prince. That was a soundtrack to a movie. You had Rocky, all those great hits for Rocky, Top Gun, Pretty in Pink, on and on. We have, I think we have about 15 or 16 in the book that we consider to be the essential soundtracks, and the ones that you know, on their own, if you were to hand somebody that particular soundtrack album, you could say, yeah, this is essential music from this decade. It really represents both the spirit and the sound of the 80s.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, we had interviewed some of the men who were behind the songs for Dirty Dancing, and they said, really, the songs is what saved the movie, right? Okay, so what's next? I know you're asked that, and you're like, look, let me take a breather first, because I just got done with this one. What's next?
It is funny, the 80s and 90s books we did back to back, because that seemed like a good idea at the time. But we got them done, we got them out. We're very happy with them, and I was joined, of course, by a great group of contributors in both books. They really need to be mentioned, because really good writers who brought a great deal to the book. Now I'm actually on to another Neil Young book, with my frequent collaborator, Daniel Dirkholz, and we're hoping for a green light for the Essential 70s books book at some point. So if the good people out there go buy lots of copies of the Essential 80s and 90s, we'll get our green light for the 70s and really be able to have some fights about what's in that.
You're absolutely right about, because because 70s is that's my moment. That was my golden age, and I kept thinking no 70s, but when I saw your 80s book, I was like, oh. So yeah, you're right. There's gonna be I'm gonna have an internal battle, but I'm glad that you gave me a reason to want you back. Okay, so that's number one. And let me just say to you, I love this music talk, because what you've given me was, well, I've had the time of my life, and I owe it all to you. So Gary, thank you so much. Like I said earlier, it sparked so many conversations in the office, even from some of our people who I think were born in the 80s.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that's what we wanted to do.
All right, we'll see you back soon.
Okay, take care.
All right, Gary Graff's latest book, 501 Essential Albums of the 80s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide, is out May 20th, everywhere books are sold. For more details on Gary's various projects, visit greatdayhouston.com, and we will connect you.